Okay. All right. So I'm here with Max Parry. And Max Parry is an independent journalist. He's been published in the UN's Review, as well as the Greenville Post and many other prominent blogs and websites. He's a critic of U.S. foreign policy and the dominant narratives. And I thought I would have Max on here to talk about some of the stuff he's written. One theme in your work seems to be the rewriting of the history of the Second World War. Can you talk about that? Because that's something I've observed a lot.
Well, it would be difficult to avoid observing it. It's especially in wake of these last few years and the growing geopolitical tensions between the United States and Russia. In the last few years, especially, we've seen a concerted effort, not just by the United States, but their European allies or Western allies, to go back and basically start doctoring the official history of the Second World War, and more specifically the crucial role that the Soviet Union played in the victory over Nazi Germany. Especially, we saw this just this past year. There was a European Union resolution where they actually, in a kind of a pinnacle example of horseshoe theory, actually tied the catalyst for the war to the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is very different from the history that we've even gotten from them, even throughout the Cold War. They're actually trying to attribute it to that specific event. Was what was the starting point for the war.
Right.
And I think a lot of this has to do with the current geopolitical tensions between the United States and Russia. That's the reason for their doing this. I mean, it's really a continuation of the writing out of the Soviet role that took place during the Cold War. But I think with the renewal of tensions between the U.S. and Russia in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been like a kind of a reset of that. And this EU resolution from last year, I think, was like the most egregious example. But it's happening in many other areas, whether it's the U.S. support for the post-Maidan government in Ukraine, the regimes in the Baltic states, which are also equally as involved in not just rewriting the history of World War II and the Soviet role in it, but outright Holocaust revisionism. And they're going back and they're rewriting the history of these states that were once a part of the USSR that have gained their so-called independence. And they're going back and they're rewriting the history of the nationalists, the Nazi collaborators, whether it's in the Baltic states or in the Ukraine, the people that sided with Germany when they invaded. They're going back and they're rewriting that history as they just fought for nationalist independence. They weren't actual participants in the Holocaust, which is absolutely not true. They were. They didn't just participate in it. They shared the racism of the Nazis, and they're going back and they're rewriting that history. And in the Ukraine, the post-Maidan government has instituted what they call decommunization laws, where they're actually removing all traces of Soviet history, whether it's statues or street names, and they're erecting monuments and changing the names of streets to many of these nationalist figures who participated in the Holocaust and fought on the Axis side. Whether it's Stepan Bandera.
World War II memorials. You would think there would be more outrage about that around the world. But yet it's been just completely written out of American media. You wouldn't know what's going on. And in fact, you see the opposite. You see an attempt to paint, communists and forces that are defending those World War II memorials as if they are somehow fascists or Nazi sympathizers. It's like it's all just been, rewritten. I've also seen that in some countries throughout Europe, they are using the laws against Holocaust denial, and they're expanding them to include communist denial. So if you're critical in any way of how they are rewriting the history of the Soviet Union, they equate you with a Nazi. They say that that's the same thing as Holocaust denial, and people have been charged in Czechoslovakia and other places. Have you heard about this in Poland, elsewhere?
Yeah, it's very interesting. In Poland, I know there was a big diplomatic rift between Poland and Russia over Auschwitz, and the Polish government is going back and trying to claim that the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz was actually just the exchange of one occupation for another, which is absolutely not true. And this resulted in a big diplomatic row between Moscow and Poland. It's very interesting that they're making this kind of false equivalency, because the liberal political establishment in the West and these sort of right-wing populist regimes, like in Poland and Hungary, are very fond of appearing dead set against one another. But it seems like they actually share the same sort of historical revisionist ideas about World War II history, where they're equating Holocaust denialism with what you're talking about, Soviet denialism, which is very interesting, because there's been such a conflict supposedly between the anti-EU right-wing populists and the sort of liberal EU political establishment. But it seems like when it comes to demonizing Russia and going back and changing this World War II history and making a false equivalency between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, it actually seems like they're very much on the same page. George Soros is a perfect example of somebody like that. And you would think that it would be unlikely that someone like him and the Hungarian government would be in agreement about anything, but it seems like they are when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Right. They have anti-Soros laws in Hungary and such. Now, one interesting thing is I've seen that Timothy Snyder, the professor at Yale, he wrote that whole book, Bloodlands, which was an attempt to say that the pro-Soviet forces in Europe during World War II were just as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis. And that, you see him now cited in a lot of left-wing forums as this expert on totalitarianism, as this anti-Trump theoretician. But really, he's playing a role of trying to softly downplay the idea that the Nazis were the main enemy in the war. I mean, that seems to be the role he's playing as a Russian historian.
Yeah, it seems to me like he's giving a different sort of more moderate spin on what stuff like the Black Book of Communism did, and various other texts that are really based on information from people like Solzhenitsyn, who was a huge anti-Semite, and also, praised the collaborationist Russian Liberation Army. Seems to me like what people like Snyder are doing is kind of like a more moderate version of what texts like that did, where the figures that they give for the supposed amount of deaths that occurred under communism are just so. First of all, they're not based on anything that's in the Soviet archives, which we have access to now, and historians have been studying for 3 decades. But not only that, they are just they're impossible. If you look at any statistics related to the way that the Soviet population actually increased exponentially over a period of decades as they industrialized. So, the Soviet government was supposedly, I mean, when you see these figures of like 60 million people, it's just literally not even remotely possible. So anyway, yeah, it seems like what somebody like Snyder is doing is transmitting the same message, but in a different way.
Well, what I think is interesting is I noticed that recently the Victims of Communism Memorial, which is one of these places that comes up with these huge numbers, has decided to list all the victims of coronavirus as victims of communism, add them to the total. Have you seen this?
Yes, I did see that.
And it's like, so now are we going to every pandemic that originated in the United States or in a capitalist country, every disease, are we going to add that to capitalism? I mean, this is pretty ridiculous. And keep in mind that now the United States and our economic system is having a bigger death toll and a bigger suffering rate than the socialist country China did. So how does this even?
They're going to score an old goal on that one.
Yeah, it just shows how spurious the logic is when they come up with these numbers. And that's not to say that bad things didn't happen, human rights weren't violated, but I mean, it's just they come up with this body count, this huge number, and then they announce that that therefore anyone who supports a socialist country or advocates moving towards socialism is on the verge of committing genocide. I mean, this is just silly, absurd logic, and we're forced to accept it. And often liberals and even social democrats who do uphold socialism won't really push back against it. They're afraid to push back against it, right? I mean, there's this, we saw Bernie Sanders get hammered over his statements supporting Fidel Castro and such. And those statements were always, followed with criticisms around human rights and stuff, but just acknowledging any economic achievement by a socialist government.
He wasn't even really praising Castro. He was just literally acknowledging what are really almost universally acknowledged facts about the achievements of the Cuban healthcare system and their education system. The standard of living is the highest in all of Latin America. This is not whatever else anybody wants to say about post-revolutionary Cuba. Those things are not in dispute. He's going based on actual facts. But even that, not even acknowledging that they achieved anything, is possible without being stigmatized, and equated with supporting, totalitarianism and all that. So, yeah, we very frequently see, the social democrats and people, you'd expect to defend the achievements will suddenly fall right in line when it comes to demonizing socialism.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And then you also get this idea that a lot of these forces will put out that somehow fascism and National Socialism and Hitler are all left-wing ideologies, right? And that's a really, these are of the left. This is another form of communism. There was that whole book written by Jonah Goldberg, Liberal Fascism, trying to argue that Adolf Hitler was a leftist because he had been a bohemian artist and he was a vegetarian. And that this is a common trope. They can't make up their minds. Is it that communists, are worse than fascists, or is it that fascists are actually just communists themselves, even though, the main rallying cry of fascists when they came to power was kill all the communists. The main people fighting against fascists were communists. But let's not quibble with details here. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, the attempts to just try and respin history And then we see Trump share a Mussolini quote, during the election. He tweets out a quote from Mussolini. So I guess, is he quoting out somebody who's like his opponents? They can't get their story straight about left and right. All of this doesn't make any sense. I mean, what do you make of this? It's just bizarre how they're trying to rewrite history.
Well, I think what disturbs me the most actually is when I see this sort of red-brown aspersion going on, used as an attack on people on the left by people who are supposedly on the left, where they, for example, you call someone a Strasserist or a neo-Strasserist, implying that within the Nazi Party there was supposedly a left wing that was purged in the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Long Knives. So they're
the Night of the Long Knife, right?
Yeah, where they're actually, so on the one hand you have people on the right, the PragerU types, conflating socialism with saying that the Nazis were really socialists. But then you also have these people on the left that are doing the same thing in a different way, where they're actually arguing that within the Nazi Party there was a so-called Socialist Wing, and they use this term to denote people who often defend the Soviet Union, not unlike myself, where they implied that there was actually a conspiracy, an alliance, an unstated alliance between the Nazis and the Soviets, with not just with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is always something that's written about without any proper context to how it developed, why that decision came about, how the Soviets' numerous attempts to form an alliance with the other Allied powers was thwarted, and they really had no other choice but to do what they did. But with this this myth of a red-brown alliance, they're really sort of saying the same thing but in a different way, and it's very disturbing because it seems like people on both sides of the political aisle have a complete misunderstanding of so much of the history of World War II.
Yeah, well, on my last YouTube live, I talked about, some of the research I'm doing for my new book. And, there is a Marxist understanding of fascism that goes back, decades. You can talk about R. Palm Dutt. He had a great book called Fascism and Social Revolution. But there was the Georgy Dimitrov and his analysis, and communists always had a clear understanding that when capitalism enters a crisis, one section of the ruling class will try to seize control of the government and stabilize the economy with mass political repression to crush the communists, to get the economy going back again, and that fascism is capitalism in decay. But coming out of what you call the new left, with forces like Theodor Adorno and Susan Sontag, you have this new definition of fascism, where fascism is some kind of weird psychosexual state of mind, right?
Hannah Arendt too.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt also. And these people were all being covertly supported by the CIA. I mean, Partisan Review magazine was like the fountain of this. In Germany, they had Der Monat, which was where Adorno got his start. The authoritarian personality study that Adorno did, he actually did it in coordination with Nevitt Sanford, who had worked for British intelligence at the Tavistock Institute. And they came up with this F scale, and it's like, if you don't like jazz music and you like classical music, you're fascist. If you don't if you're uncomfortable with what they call modern sexual practices, you're a fascist. And it's this whole thing. If you don't like ambiguity, if you like things to be very clear, you're a fascist. And it's like fascism is a mindset, fascism is a behavior pattern, and it's a way to totally obscure the reality, which is that there's an economic understanding. When capitalism goes into crisis, the ruling class does this. And this is what is put out in so many left-wing circles. And what I think is fascinating is one of the main sources of this mindset, this psychosexual interpretation of fascism that obscures the leftist and materialist and Marxist analysis, is the crackpot Wilhelm Reich. Do you know Wilhelm Reich?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a guy who like had the orgone machine that was like gonna match energy. Yeah, this is a guy who, I mean, ended up going to prison because he was defrauding people. I mean, there's nothing remotely credible. But if you open The Authoritarian Personality by Adorno, it's right there in the book. He cites Wilhelm Reich as an influence on his work. And the CIA poured loads of money into just obscuring the Marxist understanding of what fascism actually is, and replacing it with this definition that could be applied to any mass movement, right? I mean, any political movement, any religious movement, right? You're going to have people in the group who like to work in groups, who work together, who have strong principles they believe in. And so it's like, according to their definition, you're a fascist if you get anything done, and that the left is just striving for individualism and sexual liberation, and we're just not going to talk about class struggle or economics or anything like that. It's very, very poisonous, and this was all developed by the CIA. I mean, the CIA funded this. This was the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, was one of their most successful operations. And it's a way to obscure what fascism actually is. And on the right, they don't even know what to make of this stuff. I mean, it's even more bizarre. And now you have all this literature about cultural Marxism, where they go off on Adorno, all these CIA people. You know, they're not talking about what the Soviet Union said. They're not talking about what Marx and Lenin said. They're talking about what Adorno and Sontag wrote. I mean, it's bizarre the way that the situation and the narrative around this has developed. What do we do? How do we challenge this?
Well, I think that that the actual history that went on, of the sort of trajectory that of the left into its current degraded state, that needs to be fully fleshed out. I really don't think it's been written about enough, because it's certainly not widely understood enough. I mean, I don't think it's possible to overstate the sort of long-term damage that not just Adorno, but really the entire Frankfurt School had on the left, at which we see the residual effects of today. You know, with the dominance of identity politics and you know, all these very individualist-centered movements. Yeah, I don't think that there's been a lot written about the CIA's role in the Congress for Cultural Freedom related to promoting modern arts and things like that, but I don't think there's been enough written about how they actually, you know, were poring over literary and intellectual magazines and really enlisting the intelligentsia. And we're, you know, you see the effects that it's had really the last 30 to 40 years, where while this stuff was taking precedent, you saw, you know, the complete eradication of labor unions, basically the writing out of class itself as an important issue. It's just now only returning to the forefront of Western politics, only because of the economic crisis. Up until that point, it was, you know, in a period of dormancy, and I think it's because of the long-term damage done by people like Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse was another one.
Worked for the State Department at one point. I mean, you know, how did he get to be the spokesman for leftism and Marxism, you know?
Well, I mean, one of the things that they're definitely at the center of what we're talking about, because they were, as you say, really kind of at the center of conflating Germany and the Soviet Union as these sort of like twin pillars of totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
While, you know, the Soviet Union was actually thriving in the 1930s while the rest of the world was going through the Great Depression. They were industrializing in a single decade, what took the British an entire century. They basically turned a mostly agrarian, illiterate society that was and industrialized it in a single decade and introduced science and education, literacy, you name it, in a very, very, very rapid period of time, and just in time enough to build up their defenses to be able to withstand the biggest war machine in the world at the time, in the Wehrmacht, which was built up by Wall Street. And so they really did a lot to diminish and discredit the achievements of the Soviet Union, and conflate it with Nazi Germany, even though these are supposed to be Marxists.
Indeed.
I actually went through a period when I was younger where I really read a lot of the Frankfurt School, because in college it's really the kind of primary form of Marxism that young students in the United States will encounter. That's what they'll be introduced to. I mean, for me, that's what I encountered first. And, the original, not just Marx, but Lenin and other people's writings was always presented as, antiquated, and they, that it was the idea that the working class was like a revolutionary force was like this outdated concept. Marx and Lenin, they didn't anticipate, the importance of identity politics and women's liberation or the environmentalism, things like that. So that's sort of the first stuff that a lot of people encounter, and it's the first stuff that I encountered. And, the Frankfurt School, they did some useful things in terms of, they used Marxism as like a lens through which to analyze the arts and culture and things like that. They did some useful stuff in that regard. But the damage that they did in terms of demonizing the Soviet Union and really socialism generally, it's just impossible to overstate how much damage, because that stuff is still held up, especially in academia, Western Marxism. That stuff is held up as like what Marxism actually is. That's what a lot of young people today, if they go to college, that's what they're going to encounter. And what was Marx's own writings and what was done in the Soviet Union is viewed as a failure rather than the actual success that it was.
Let me ask you, I guess, where can people find your work and find some of your writings compiled?
Actually, they could have. I don't have a website yet. I had all my stuff compiled on medium.com, but I actually just got a banned by them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They're increasingly compromised. They've got the Atlantic Council policing their content these days. So I was found to be in violation of community guidelines or whatever.
Wow. Unbelievable.
I'm sure it had something to do with my writing about how the impeachment was actually, the U.S. supplying arms to neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which is a red flag for the Atlantic Council. But my work is syndicated, like you said, at the Unz Review, Granville Post. Sometimes it gets picked up by other places, great websites like American Herald Tribune, Dissident Voice, the Center for Research on Globalization. All
I
great
really
outlets
encourage
for
people
alternative.
to check out Max's work. It's very good. He's a very good writer. So thanks for talking to us tonight, Max, and I will be sure to post this on YouTube. Sounds good?
Thank you, Caleb. It was great chatting with you. Take
Thank you.
care.
Yep, yep.